Pastor, you ready? So just to start off the AHEPA meeting with in this presentation with the prayer, if we could please rise and sing Sosanesti, and then we'll have our president of our AHEPA, Gus Constantine, introduce our speaker this evening. Christos anesti ek nekron, thanato, thanaton patisas ketis embis mimasi zoi arisameros. Lord Jesus Christ, who is resurrected from the dead, so that you may ascend into heaven, descend down upon us the Holy Spirit, we ask for the blessing today of the AHEPA Gold Coast chapter presentation and for our speaker. And we ask to bless the food and drinks of your servants. This we ask in the holy name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And with that, if we can have the president come, Gus Constantine.
Okay. I turned it. Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm George. I am a professor of church history at Fordham University, and I co-direct something called the Orthodox Christian Studies Center there. And so in my capacity of running that program, my understanding of kind of current global events in the Orthodox world is greatly expanded beyond my own research, which is really in the Middle Ages. So people are probably going to have more, the question and answer period is likely going to be more beneficial than anything I say to begin. So I'm going to keep my opening remarks pretty brief. But to understand the religious dimensions of the war in Ukraine, you really have to understand the history of the Rus, right, the Russian people. And that history begins in what is today Ukraine. Okay, so modern Russian identity, its birthplace is Kiev, which is in Ukraine. All right, so what do I mean when I say this? Prior to the 9th century, the Russian people were a loose confederation of moving tribes, largely. They had princes. There was no king, there was no czar. They had princes. They were pagans of a variety of different stripes. In the late 9th century, one of their princes, Vladimir, converted to Christianity at the hands of Byzantine missionaries. And with the baptism of Vladimir to a specifically Byzantine version of Christianity, the Russian people began to import a great number of cultural dimensions from Byzantium. So the notion of an emperor, art, architecture, literature, written language. All of these are importations from Byzantium, which are modified to suit a sort of medieval Russian cultural context, right? So this is the birth of Old Slavonic. But again, all of this, the people were called the Rus, right? but it all takes place in what is today Kiev, which is the capital of the modern nation state of Ukraine. I'm going to fast forward a long time. For a variety of reasons, 500 years after that, the center of the political establishment of the Russian people had to leave Ukraine, actually because of invasions caused by the Mongols. So they had to leave what is today Ukraine and Kiev, and they migrated north. And in that migration north, they founded what became Moscow. Okay? And so, as the centuries progressed, the cultural center of the Russian people moved to what is today Moscow, but its birthplace had remained Kiev. Okay? Let me jump several more centuries for you. The early 20th century. Okay? The Russians in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century had established a very large, very powerful empire, a Tsarist empire that had imported a great number of Western ideas and Western innovations and so forth and so on. And so there was this kind of struggle in Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. Are we Eastern or are we Western? Are we European or are we Asian? And this was very much an ongoing debate within the Russian people. Okay? At precisely the same time that there was also a number of people advocating for the poor in a certain way that basically took the peasantry, and advocating for the peasantry ended up with communism. And so in 1917, you had a uniquely Russian version of Marxism, Karl Marx, right? The author of the Communist Manifesto, a Westerner, he was a German, okay? But you had Western-inspired intellectuals in Russia who led a revolution in Russia that completely transformed Russia. It was no longer named Russia, it became the Soviet Union. And Christianity and all religions in the Soviet Union became illegal. The Christian community suffered more in Russia in the 20th century than probably any other Christian community in the history of the world. Millions upon millions upon millions of Christians were killed. Thousands upon thousands of Christian churches were destroyed. All right? The Soviets martyred more Christians than the Romans did. Okay? Now, the difference between communism in the Soviet Union and, say, communism in a place like Serbia or Romania or these other Eastern Bloc countries, right, is that in Russia it started in 1917. In Serbia, Romania, and the other Eastern Bloc countries, Czechoslovakia, it started after World War II. And in all of these cases, it ends in 1989. Now, the difference is when it ends in 1989, in Serbia, in Romania, in Slovenia, in the Czech Republic, there is a living memory of Christianity because communism only lasted 40 years. But in Russia, there is no living memory of Christianity because it lasted more than 70 years. Right? Or there is very little living memory of Christianity. There was underground Christianity in Russia, but there is very little living memory of what Christianity was in Russia. Okay, so now, when the Soviet Union collapses, all of the old guys that ran the Soviet Union are still in charge. All right? Putin was the head of the KGB. So all the same guys are in charge. But they understand that they can no longer be communists, and they have to figure out, A, what type of government they're going to have, B, what kind of economy they're going to have. More importantly for us, they had to figure out, who are we as a people? What does it mean to be Russian? Because all of the propaganda of the previous 70 years of the Soviet regime, they had to completely do away with. And so all the ex-communists that are running the Russian state have to come up with a narrative that explains what makes Russia important, what makes Russia distinctive, and what makes Russia non-Western. And so a lot of the intellectuals that are driving the show land on Orthodox Christianity for two reasons. One, it's accurate. Orthodox Christianity is what gave original meaning to the very first people of Rus. The importation of Byzantine Christianity, its blending with Slavic culture, was what was the original Russian thing, right? It's what bound those people together initially. But the other dimension of it is that Orthodox Christianity is not Western Christianity. So it allowed them to have something that was 1,000 years old, but still different from the Europeans. The problem, of course, is that the birthplace of this uniquely Russian civilizational moment is now no longer part of the Russian Empire, because with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had become its own nation. Okay? So you had a completely different nation trying to understand its own history, its own uniqueness, its own place of being, which was largely framed as, we are not Russian. They saw Russians as imperialists, as colonialists, as people who had suppressed Ukrainians for the previous several hundred years. And so Ukrainian identity was very much mixed up in a, we are not Russian. We're not fully Western, but we're not Russian. And Russian identity is all bound up with our origins are Kiev. Okay? And they say that most people see the world when they're older in life. They see the world through the eyes of when they were 30 or 40 or 50, right? So in other words, the debates, the disputes that animated your life in your 30s, 40s, or 50s are still going to be the dominant narrative of your life in your 70s and 80s. Okay, so take a figure like Vladimir Putin. What was the animating element of his younger life? It was Russia, good, NATO, bad. Right? He can only see the world in terms of Russia, good, NATO, bad. All right? Now, Putin, despite all appearances for Western journalists, Putin is not a Christian. He is almost certainly an atheist. But Putin, like the other ex-communists in the 1990s and early 2000s, tried for a time to play with the idea that he could build a constituency within Russia by doubling down on Russia's Orthodox identity, its Orthodox roots, and so forth. And this was a very big part of Putin's sort of political and propaganda campaign in the early 2000s. He was president for a period. He ran into term limits. He had to step aside. He was prime minister. Then he came back as president, and they did away with the term limits. Right? Since he has returned, in terms of Russia itself, he has abandoned any interest in promoting Orthodox Christianity. He only promotes Orthodoxy for Western audiences. It is no longer a dimension of his internal political persona. Right? And to give you, so let me put this before you, right? So in the United States is widely regarded by people who either like it or not as being a secular space. You have a very clear separation of religion and culture, religion and politics, right? You have a judiciary that adjudicates cases according to this notion of separation of church and state, and so forth and so on. And so there is this perception that the United States is a deeply secular space. Okay? And yet, 30% of Americans attend church every week. In Russia, at least for Western cameras, you have a projection that we are Orthodox, we are Orthodox, we are Orthodox, we are going to legislate according to Orthodox tradition, it's intrinsic to our blood, it's who we are. 1 or 2% of the population attends church weekly. In other words, you might have a president who will go in front of the camera and receive communion, or go to a monastery and make a donation. But none of the people in Russia actually go to church, or very few of them actually go to church. In the United States, you have a secular government, but you have very active religious participation, right? So in both cases, it's kind of the opposite of what you think. Now, when there was a moment when the Patriarch of Moscow was very much in the good graces of Putin. So Patriarch Kirill, and he was part of his inner circle. But about 10 years ago, Putin effectively, as I said, gave up on considering being invested or interested in religion in Russia itself. It's only for Western cameras, right? And as a consequence of that, Patriarch Kirill is no longer in Putin's inner circle. He has been pushed to the side because Putin has basically decided he has gotten all that he can get out of the church, and Kirill no longer offers him anything. When Putin drove the propaganda campaign to justify his invasion of Ukraine, in part, it was about NATO. In part, and this is what's so insidious about it, in part, it was that the Russian army and the Russian government was going to protect Ukraine, which they saw as part of a larger Russia. They were going to protect this part of a larger Russia that had been so infected by Western secularism that they had gay pride parades. Right? This was repeatedly part of the propaganda that Putin was circulating. In other words, what is the best demonstration of secularism? The best demonstration of secularism is government support for a gay pride parade. Okay? Complete and utter nonsense. But this is kind of, again, for Western cameras, this is the way that Putin justified, at least to the extent that there was any kind of religious justification for the war. It's that Western secularism, Western hedonism, had corrupted what was historically a Russian space, Ukraine, and that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is thus a liberation so that the Ukrainians can return to true Orthodoxy. All of this is complete nonsense. Patriarch Kirill, who is really, really desperate to get back into Putin's good graces, has not only accepted all of that, but has taken it several steps further by, for example, claiming that any Russian soldier who dies in Ukraine will immediately have all of their sins forgiven and they will go straight to heaven. I am a scholar of Byzantine church history. That is what the popes and the crusaders used to say. That is something that the Orthodox have always categorically rejected. Right? I'm not saying that the Orthodox have rejected moral causes in war. I'm saying the Orthodox have always rejected the notion that a soldier who dies in battle automatically has their sins forgiven and they go straight to heaven. But that is precisely the language that Patriarch Kirill is offering as an effort to appease Putin. There is one additional element that is unique here that I want to talk about, and then I'll open it for questions. And that is basically what has happened in Ukraine itself since the war started and how religion is playing out. Ukraine, you might not know this about Ukraine, Ukraine is the most religiously diverse country in Europe. There's a very large Jewish population, there's a large Catholic population, there's a large Orthodox population, there's a large Eastern Rite Catholic population, there is a small Islamic population, there is a small Protestant population. The most religiously diverse place in Europe. Of the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, and Orthodox Christianity is the largest religious body in Ukraine, there are two different jurisdictions. One, they do not have their own church, or they have not historically. The largest is a church administered directly from Moscow, and one is a much smaller, independent autocephalous church that was only created in 2000. Just looking at those two bodies, it was probably about 90% to 10%. But one of the things that has come out since the war started is that some of the leaders, not the leader, so in other words, not the metropolitan, but some of the individual abbots of the monasteries and some individual priests and some individual bishops have actually been active collaborators with the Russian army. Right? Because they're in Ukraine, but they're part of a church that belongs to Russia. And the church in Russia has basically been dissolved into, or devolved into a Department of State. Okay? And as a consequence of this, the president of Ukraine, who's basically a secularist, a secular Jew, actually, he and others have been agitating to criminalize the institutional church that still belongs to Russia, and to force anybody that wants to be an Orthodox Christian in Ukraine to join the independent Ukrainian, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. There is actually a bill in the Ukrainian parliament right now that is seeking to do just that. It's unclear exactly what's going to happen. There have been different draft versions of this bill, some of which have been more restrictive, some have been less restrictive. You have, it puts many people in the West kind of in this really awkward position, because on the one hand, the West really wants to support Ukraine against just a really clear imperialist, unauthorized, immoral war, right? And at the same time, typically in the West, we believe in principles of religious freedom, religious tolerance, and so forth. And so how are you going to criminalize an entire church that constitutes 40% of your population, right? So that in the last 6 months or so the war's been going on a little more than 2 years. In the last 6 months or so, that is the really new wrinkle in trying to sort of parse out the complicated nature of the religious dimensions of what's going on in Ukraine. My guess, as somebody who studied autocephaly, which means the sort of independent jurisdictions within the Orthodox world, my guess is that within 100 years, there will probably be one institutional church in Ukraine, and it will be independent of Moscow. But it's going to take a long time for that to happen. And it may be the case that you have these two groups overlapping for a very long time, kind of like you have in the United States, right? I mean, in New York alone, canonically, there should be one Orthodox bishop of New York. We have 6. Right? There's an Orthodox one, there's a Russian one, there's an OCA one, there's an Antiochian one, there's a Serbian one. You get the idea, right? There will be some of that in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Okay, I'll stop there and take any questions that you have. Okay. Any festival meeting questions? I actually run the kitchen at the St. Patterson festival. So if you want to know anything about baking pasticcio, I'm happy to help you. Attend church weekly. So I have 2 statistics for you. Right. So I have 2 statistics for you. In the United States, whether we're Greek or Russian or Serbian or whatever, we like to claim that we have a lot of people in the United States, and it's true. There are a lot of people of Greek, Russian. There are a lot of people. There are millions and millions and millions of people of Orthodox descent in the United States. Okay. It's much more than that. But if you actually have somebody from Pew knock on your door and ask you to fill out a survey about religious affiliation, only 0.5% of Americans self-identify as an Orthodox Christian. Okay, so basically Orthodox Christianity in the United States is a statistical anomaly. It's about the same size as Mormonism. Okay, in terms of people who are willing to fill out a survey to say that I'm an Orthodox Christian. In the Greek Orthodox Church, so I'm not speaking for the Serbs or the Russians or Antiochians or Copts or whatever, just in the GOA, and this is a figure that the GOA has published, interviewing 30 and 40-year-olds, okay, so not older, not younger, 50% of people raised in the Greek Orthodox Church say they are no longer Greek Orthodox. 50%. So the survey doesn't ask them why, and it's going to be a lot of reasons, right? And that's going to change based on age group, right? But that's right. So in terms of those like those are the real numbers, right? Yeah. 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 So I mean, this is now there are much. Again, this is a talk about Ukraine. Bring me back, and I can talk about these issues. The one thing I will say, not that it provides any solace, but just so you understand the broader picture, that is largely in line with the broader American public. And actually, mainline Protestant churches are losing about 60 or 70%. Right? Some of it is offset with conversion, whether through marriage or through seeking. But in terms of the people raised in the church, so in other words, it's not that we're 50% smaller because we bring people in too, right? But that's the number of people who are opting out, so to speak. Okay. Yeah. Again, that's. Well, I don't really know how to compare it other than to say my sense is that a lot of the people that attend those things, they don't end up being lifers. In other words, they're going through a moment of their life. They go through a period of their life where this kind of thing is particularly appealing, but it doesn't last. And they cycle through. Yes, so I'll repeat the question for the live stream. So the question is basically, do I think that the ecumenical patriarch's granting of autocephaly to this smaller group, this independent group in Ukraine, did that have anything to do with the invasion? It certainly angered Patriarch Kirill. I think it led Putin, it convinced Putin that his decision to ignore the Church of Russia had been the right one because it wasn't going to get him what he as a younger man thought it would get him. I do not think that it factored at all into Putin's personal calculus for whether or not to invade Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that it could not then nevertheless be instrumentalized as a sort of propaganda reason for doing it. I think Putin's real reasons are he always thought of Ukraine as Russian, right? He thinks of Ukraine and Belarus as Russian. He had been on record going back 15 years that the worst thing that had ever happened to the Russian people was the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? He still thinks Georgia, Kazakhstan, right? He still thinks all of them should be part of Russia. And he really does, even though he's not himself a Christian, he really does see the origins of the distinctive Russian civilization in Ukraine. And it's like a cognitive dissonance, right? Psychological term. It means when reality contradicts ideology, right? It literally sets off a psychotic condition, right? And so having the source of Russian identity belong to an ever increasingly Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU country led him to make what is, like, financially and militarily an extraordinary mistake, right? And morally, right? But I don't think the autocephaly did it. It might have had a piece of why, it might have been a piece of why Kirill has been all in, maybe. And it is certainly playing itself out in interesting ways in terms of what's going on in in Ukraine with respect to this new law, right? That wouldn't have been a thing if there wasn't this autocephalous church, but yeah. Yeah, no, he's really horrible. Yeah, really, really horrible. And I mean, it's a big debate, especially among the Russians, right? And the Russians in exile. Like, what do we do? Like, even, like, literally across the water here in Seacliff, right? Yeah, I know these people. They're really, really wrestling with, because if you go to a ROCOR church, they still commemorate Kirill. Right? If you go to an OCA church, of course, you don't commemorate Kirill. But if you go to a ROCOR church, Russian Orthodox church outside of Russia, you're supposed to commemorate Kirill in every liturgy. See, the Greeks do it differently. Here, we only commemorate our archbishop. We don't commemorate the ecumenical patriarch unless we have a bishop here. But when it's just Father John, you're only commemorating your local bishop. For the Russians, every parish across the globe, regardless of their bishop, is supposed to commemorate Kirill, despite the fact that the guy has lost it. Like he is simply not preaching orthodoxy. Right. So, yes. Yeah. So, really good question. It's interesting, when he was running for president, it was at exactly the same time that the autocephaly thing was happening. And so Zelensky's a fascinating guy. So his previous career, he was a comedian. Now, to be fair, he had a law degree too, right? So he's not a simpleton, right? So he was a very shrewd guy, but at the time when autocephaly was going on and he was running for president, he was making jokes about it all the time, because Ukraine, like Russia, even though it's religiously diverse, is a largely secular space, right? The percentage of people who go to church, so let's take the people who go to church on Sunday in Ukraine. Prior to the war, did they really care whether the church was administered independently in Ukraine versus administered over the border in Moscow? Most of them probably didn't even know the difference. They probably wouldn't have even cared. If I asked my Sunday school class to name the patriarch or the archbishop, I'm a good Sunday school teacher. Most of them can't do it, right? So does the average parishioner really care? Okay, so Zelensky kind of made fun of it all. Since the war has started, he has been confiscating the properties of parishes that have been proven to collaborate with the invasion. And he is supporting this bill, which will effectively criminalize participation in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. Right? So he's supporting that as a wartime measure. And actually, what the law actually says is, what the law is basically saying is that you cannot have an operating church in this country that is administered by a nation at war with Ukraine. That's the way the law reads. or the last draft of it that I saw. That's how the law reads. So theoretically, as soon as the war is over, it would be fine. But he's in support of it. And probably because he is effectively secular himself. A little more than 2 years. Correct. If you include Crimea, yeah, it's been going on for 10 years. Poroshenko? Okay, so I left that part out, right? So Putin actually tolerated an independent Ukraine so long as its president was effectively a Russian puppet. Okay? And when they basically had to steal an election in the mid-2010s, I don't remember if it was 14 or 16, I think 14, when they basically had to steal an election to keep the Moscow appointed guy in charge because the other guy had overwhelmingly won. There were riots in the streets and huge protests known as the Maidan, right? And that effectively forced the Putin puppet to flee. And they had actually even tried to poison, right? They'd even poisoned the Western-looking guy, but he survived. And so the election cycle before Zelensky was when all of this occurred. And so there was a Western-leaning guy who came in, and then there was a new election, and I think that guy was still running, and Zelensky was running, and a pro-Russian guy was running, and Zelensky won. The church, I don't think the church factored into the elections previously. Right? I don't think it really played itself out in the elections previously. It could now I think all elections are suspended because of the war. It could play itself out when the war's over. But no, I don't think it played itself out in the election per se. It was really a pro-Western because Ukraine itself, so even in the eastern regions of Ukraine, you do have dominantly Russian-speaking populations. And the further west you go, the Ukrainian dialect is more Polish or German or what have you. I mean, we have an actual Ukrainian here, you can tell us, but that's how I'm told that it is. Yeah. So do you mean in the GOA parishes? So like in terms of cultural identity, language and liturgy, that's the sort of thing you're asking? So I would, I'll be very clear up front. I have written, right, that I've published before that I am in favor of moving liturgy in the GOA to 90% English, right? I'm not exempting priests from learning ancient Greek because they need it to be able to explain the Gospels intelligently. But I personally am of the opinion that if we are going to minister to our children who don't know any Greek, we pretend they do, but they don't, then we need to do it in English, right? And precisely for marriage, so that we don't have a sort of wall of Greek when they come. So I will give you one statistic. In the GOA, in the last 15 years, 90% of the marriages performed in GOA churches. So I'm not talking about getting married in a Catholic church or a Lutheran church or on the beach. I mean being married right here. 90% of those are mixed marriages across the country. Now, some parishes more or less, right? Maybe fewer in Astoria or Flushing, but you get the idea. It's 90% across the country. So I get bent out of shape about the language thing. Like I advocate for it as much as I can. I will say that when you leave the New York area, with a few exceptions of a couple parishes in Chicago or maybe a couple parishes in Boston, when you leave the New York, New Jersey area, it's 90% English everywhere. So I lecture all over the country. I grew up in Knoxville. If I go to Knoxville now, I don't even hear a word of Greek, right? If I go to Atlanta, I was just in Atlanta, maybe 10% of it was in Greek, right? Maybe 15%. So it really is a New York thing. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's immigration. It's the newspapers, right? No bishop wants to be on the front of the newspaper because they're being criticized for not keeping the ethnic thing going, right? And, it's priests as a whole try to make the right pastoral decision for the community that they have, right? Yeah. Okay, so I actually know a lot of things. I actually don't know that. By which I mean that I get behind closed doors for certain things at the Archdiocese. I can't say if it's a mandate or not. It's always been my assumption that it's left up to the priest's discernment. But I really, especially in New York, especially in big parishes, there could be instructions. I just don't know. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know specific. I don't know across the board for Orthodoxy because it has never had adequate research funding to actually study it, right? To go out and do the surveys and crunch the numbers. Like it's a discipline that I'm not competent to do, and I don't know. I mean, talking about broader secularization forces in the United States, there's all kinds of explanations for it. So anecdotally, I will say, so I grew up in the American South, so obviously the South trails New York and everything, right? But when I was a kid, there was absolutely nothing in Knoxville that was scheduled on Sunday mornings, right? No group, no sport, nobody scheduled anything on Sunday mornings, right? And that was just a sort of cultural agreement. Whether you were a believer or not, those were the rules you played by. Now, because it's not enough to play baseball 2 times a week, if you're going to get your kid a college scholarship, they have to play 6 times a week. And it's not enough to play soccer 2 times a week. If they're going to get a scholarship, they have to play 6 times a week. And the same for fencing, and the same for dancing, and the same for ballet, and the same for singing. I'm a father of 4 children. All of our kids are so overscheduled that there is no block of the week that isn't going to be scheduled with 100 different things. So part of it is just we have more disposable income to do more things, and parents follow a kind of cultural mindset that if I don't have my kid in this, and this, it will hurt them down the road for this, and this reason. Okay, so parents are simply overscheduled and they'll prioritize those things over church. So I would say that's number one. More fundamentally, I had One of the cool things about being a professor is you get to meet really, really smart people. And I have this friend, he's a priest. He's gone back to Scotland now. He was from the UK, he taught at St. Vladimir's for about 25 years. His name is Father John Bear. He had this extraordinary insight, which is that prior to the mid-20th century, anywhere you lived in the world, you would have grown up with death. Before you reached 20 years old, a family member under the age of 30 would have died. A sibling probably would have died. Your grandparents would have died in your house, right? You were just completely surrounded by death all the time. People were sick, people were dying. It was a very practical part of life. It was part of the rhythm. With the advance of modern medicine, with the advance of, by historical standards, extraordinary disposable income, we now take sick people to hospitals, the elderly to nursing homes, and hospice. All of the kind of physical, personal, emotional engagement of death that the globe endured for its past 5 million years, right, has all been farmed out and taken away from our eyes. And Father John Bear's explanation for the decline in church attendance says it actually has nothing to do with secularization. It's the number one reason that you need church to begin with has been taken away from your eyes. We aren't reminded of death. If you are reminded of death in your house, in your neighborhood, in your family, you will pay attention to the things you should pay attention to. But if you live in a completely sanitized world where death is removed from your consciousness, so too is the need for God. I find that an extraordinarily original and compelling explanation for the decline of public religion. Yeah, potentially. Potentially. What's that? Exactly. So my sense is where, so again, I go around the country. The number one recipe, like the institution is weak enough, right? Meaning the archdiocese is sufficiently weak that most parishes live and die on their own, right? The archdiocese simply doesn't have the resources, the manpower to really turn around parishes across the board. So if parishes are going to thrive, it's because they have a really good, energetic priest and they have good lay leadership, and the two work together productively. My sense for where you have communities that are really working well, like this one, like mine at St. Patterson, like fortunately several on Long Island, what those communities offer is community, right? They offer a sense of community. It may well be that death has been removed from our eyes, and so the most immediate need for God is kind of in the corner. But as Aristotle said, humans are meant to be in community, and the church can provide community, right? I mean, that's what the church does. That's what makes Orthodoxy or Catholicism different from Protestantism. It doesn't mean that Protestants don't have community, but they don't have community in the same way because they don't have ritual in the same way. Right? They don't have liturgy in the same way. And the Orthodox Church really does provide a sense of belonging that, look, the Orthodox Church, when done right, provides a sense of belonging and community that can cross and eradicate political divisiveness. I mean, it doesn't always do it, but it certainly can, right? Political divisiveness, ideology, socioeconomic class. Like, you have people at your festival who come together, all different ideological, political, cultural outlooks, but they work together for a common good. And you have people here for Holy Week who might disagree about everything, but they're happy to stand next to one another and wish them Christos Anesti, right? Because of that sense of common community. And that's what our parishes have going for them. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's most likely going to be the case that the places with the day schools and the really active Greek schools will do more. I mean, it just stands to reason that there will be more Greek done. I mean, the irony being, of course, that what you're teaching in Greek school is modern Greek, and what you're saying in liturgy is medieval Greek, right? I've been studying ancient Greek for 20 years. It's really hard. And I know those of us who go to church regularly, if you know more modern Greek than me, like if you're from Greece, if you grew up speaking Greek, which I did not, I know that the hymns we repeat all the time, you know what they mean. But if I just pull a random hymn from a feast day that you've never seen before, and I have somebody sing it, you can't translate it. Right. Right. Yeah. It's medieval Greek, or that's late ancient Greek. Yeah. No, that's so. I mean, to answer, I thought you were going in a different direction. Like, is that doing anything in terms of marriages? Like, is that keeping marriage? Like, do the Greek school programs lead to inter-community marriage? Probably, but I don't know. I mean, one of the phenomenons we have at St. Patterson, which drives me crazy, is that we really have two different communities operating at the same time. So we have, I think we're the only Greek school on Long Island that only meets on Saturdays. So it's like a long block on Saturday. And so that works for some parents. So we attract a lot of people to our Greek school who aren't actually members of our community. And so the Greek school kids, like, the overlap between Greek school and Sunday school at my parish, meaning kids that do both, is only about 10%. Right? No, well, that's part of it. Yeah, that's like that's the excuse. That they're in school 6 days a week already. We're not going to make them do something on the 7th, right? So parents are prioritizing Greek school over church. And as somebody who spent their life reading and writing about church history, that drives me crazy. Right? But, that's me. Yes. Christmas. Yeah. So this is going on. So yeah, Ukraine would be an interesting test case for this. Okay, so I don't know how much of you know about calendars, but there are functionally 3 different calendars that are operative in the Orthodox or in the world at the moment, right? So there is the Gregorian calendar, which was created with the benefit of Galileo, right, in the 16th century, and it is the most astronomically accurate calendar. Okay, so the Gregorian calendar basically adopted the dating for Christmas and Easter based on an astronomically accurate calendar in the 1600s. The Protestants were all against it at the time because when we say Gregorian, that's Pope Gregory, so it was a pope, so the Protestants didn't want to have anything to do with it. There were literally riots in Boston in the early 1700s when it was still a colony. Anyway, in the 1920s, everybody knows that the calendar that was in operation at the time of Jesus, known as the Julian calendar after Julius Caesar, a pagan, right? Everybody knows that calendar is astronomically incorrect. Everybody understands this. And it gets worse and worse each year, right? Because of the way it works. It gets worse over time. Okay? So in the 1920s, there was an effort to bring together all of the leaders of the Orthodox world to consider adopting the more astronomically accurate calendar. Now the problem is, what's going on in 1920 or 21, whatever it was? The Bolshevik Revolution started 4 years earlier. So the Russians couldn't send anybody. Okay? So, and some churches were opposed. So the church in Jerusalem didn't want to change. So as a kind of half measure, the ecumenical patriarch, the Church of Greece, and others decided, we're going to meet the Catholics halfway. We're going to correct the 13 days that the Julian calendar has messed up over the past 2,000 years. Basically, every 2,000 years, the calendar is going to be off by 13 days. And so we're going to move all of our days so that they align with the Western world and with the entire political world. Okay, so December 25th is December 25th. It's not January 7th. Russia's not there. Jerusalem opposes it. So Russia doesn't change. Jerusalem doesn't change. They are still on the old calendar. Some fundamentalists in Greece don't want to have anything to do with it. This is too Catholic. We hate the Pope. We're not going to hell. We'll keep our calendar and go to heaven. That's perhaps a not fair summary of the old calendarist thing, but you get my point, right? So there are some fringe groups here and there that insist on the old calendar. Okay? So now you have what the Catholic Church and the modern political world does. You have the old Julian way that the Russians and the Church of Jerusalem does. And now you have the vast majority of the Orthodox world in the middle that has switched the 13 days, but has not changed the formula for the calculated Easter. Now, how many of you, show of hands, think that the Orthodox calculate the date of Easter, that the Orthodox calculation of the date of Easter has to follow Passover, that that's part of the formula? Show of hands if you think that's the case. I certainly did. It's wrong. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. The dating, the formula for the picking of the date of Easter is a canon from the Council of Nicaea. That canon states Easter will be the first Sunday after the first full moon after the first day of spring. We use the exact same formula as the Catholics. It has nothing to do with Passover. So what's the difference? We don't know when the first day of spring is. We still think the first day of spring is April 6th. So some years, it doesn't cause a difference. And some years, it can be off by a month. There's even, just to make it even more complicated, there's even a further problem, which is that somewhere in the 5th or 6th century, a mathematician in Constantinople predicted using 1st century BC science when all of the full moons would be until like the year 3000 something. Naturally, that science is off. We are still going by those charts from the 6th century as to when the date of Easter should be. So we don't even follow the actual formula with the wrong first day of spring. We are following a chart from the 6th century predicting when the full moons would be, but they are off. And so this year, for example, there are actually 2 full moons between us and the Catholics. Next year it's together. Now, what's going on in Ukraine? Sorry, this is another, along with English, this is another one of my personal, pet peeves. What's going on in Ukraine is, again, in an effort to separate the Ukrainian civilization from what they would see as the imperialism of the Russian church, they are abandoning the Russian calculation for dates. Okay? So they celebrated Christmas on December 25th with most of the Orthodox world this year, but not with the Russians, right? And not with the Church of Jerusalem. I had not heard that they also wanted to make a national holiday the Catholic dating of Easter rather than the Orthodox one. I had not heard that. I could believe it, but I had not heard that. Yes. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, so what's one thing that's really interesting is that so it's not an either or, right? It's not an either or. It is definitely the case that they did I think make a good faith effort to adopt a kind of capitalist structure, but it pretty quickly devolved into a kind of mafia state, right? Where there were kind of a number of kingpins. Putin was the kingmaker, right? And so forth. And this is why these oligarchs are all such billionaires, right? But it is the case that the creation of that narrative of Russian identity did actually work. So I was involved with, I mean, I was an outside consultant. I wasn't really involved, but I was interviewed a few times. The Pew organization is hands down the best in the world for doing kind of religious statistics, right? To creating the kind of questionnaire that's going to work, that's going to, right? They are the professionals for doing this. And they did a study of religion and identity in the entire former Eastern Bloc. And the statistic that will really, really jump out at you, or the statistics that will really jump out at you, is how many people in Russia will self-identify as an Orthodox Christian. That number is over 80%. How many of them believe in God? That number is about 30%. How many of them go to church regularly? That number is about 2%. Right? So that meta-narrative that Putin and his cronies ran about what does it mean to be Russian, it means to be an Orthodox Christian, that worked. It's just that the Russians have no sense of what that actually means. Right? In other words, it's been completely elided with a kind of cultural superiority. And it doesn't really have anything to do with belief in Christ, self-sacrifice, love of neighbor, right? And so forth. Yes, I think so. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church, which he did pour lots of money into in the first decade of the 21st century, like lots of money went into it as a way to kind of prop up the new Russia and project this image, right? But that money, most of that money has since been pulled back. Like this, I have friends that worked for the Moscow Patriarchate, and over the last decade, their salaries were just cut every year, right? Because the money was disappearing. It was being reallocated to other things. But because of Kirill's own sort of desire to be in Putin's inner circle, he has allowed the institutional church to be completely subsumed into a kind of Department of State there. And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to suggest there aren't believers in Russia and that there's nobody there who understands the faith. Of course there are, right? There are authentic, real believers, and many of them are actually being persecuted for what they believe because they stand up to Putin, they stand up to Kirill. When I make these negative statements, I'm not talking about the Russians as a whole, I'm talking about the institution and Putin. Well, Armenia has its own problems. I have to say, I don't know enough about Georgia, although I'm kind of excited. I'm going in 2 years for a conference. I've never been there, so I'm excited about that. I'll report back. I do know that Romania is actually the opposite of that. Romania is having an explosion, right? Romania is quickly becoming one of the most Orthodox and building, growing kind of momentum for the Orthodox Church there of any of the former Soviet countries, and actually active participation in the church in Romania is probably greater than it is in the Church of Greece, which of course never succumbed to the Soviets. So Romania is probably, that's the opposite. I mean, are there other churches that are largely secular? Yeah, for sure. But nothing's as bad as Russia because it was there long. I mean, Ukraine was always, well, not always. For the entire Soviet period, Ukraine was part of Russia, right? So it experienced the same 70-year atheist government, right? But in Serbia or Romania or the Czech Republic, it was 40 years. So it was easier for those countries to revive. There's a real revival in Serbia too, but not like Romania. Oh, actually, I take it back. Albania really, really destroyed Christianity. Really destroyed Christianity. Like, so much so that after the Iron Curtain fell, there wasn't even a local clergyman that they could make archbishop. And so the ecumenical patriarch stepped in and took a Greek missionary in Africa and made him the Archbishop of Albania. And he's done incredible work, in the last 30 years. I've met him before. He's really an amazing man, quite old now. But he literally started from nothing. He told the story, his first Easter, there were 3 people. Yeah. So I think I've kept you long enough. Yeah. Okay. All right.